4 days. He had been in her proximity for 4 days, and he had been trying to think of something to say for 4 days. And the 4 days had produced the specific quality of someone who had been thinking about what to say for 4 days without producing the saying. This was not his standard operational mode. His standard operational mode was the operational mode of the logistics specialist, the person whose function was the organization of the supply chain's complex elements into the correct relationship, the function that required the specific kind of thinking that found the solution in the arrangement rather than in the individual component. He was good at the function. He had been good at it for 4 years across 3 postings, and the current posting at Frontier Outpost Verath-7 had the specific complexity that the Frontier posting's operational context produced. The cross-species supply chain, the bilateral relationships' logistical requirements, the specific challenge of the different traditions' different operational needs in the same supply infrastructure. He had been addressing that challenge for 3 months without the 4 days without the saying problem. The 4 days without the saying problem was specific to Senior Warrior Commander Sorvaine Thael. He had been aware of her for 3 weeks before her arrival. The awareness that the reputation produced when the reputation arrived at the outpost in the specific way of the significant figure's reputation, preceding the significant figure. The outpost's personnel had the quality of the institution preparing for the significant arrival, which was the quality of people who knew the significant figure's documentation, and who were organizing their understanding of the incoming presence around the documentation. The documentation said, unmatched, 14 engagements. The warrior the Keth command sent to the situations that required the best. She had arrived. She was the documentation, and she was also, in the 4 days of his proximity, the person that the documentation did not describe, the person who moved through the outpost's corridors with the specific quality that had produced his 4 days of trying to find the saying. He was at the main corridor's junction. The junction was where the logistics bay met the operational briefing center, the specific junction of his function and her function, the spatial meeting point of the supply chain management and the tactical assessment. She was coming from the operational briefing center. He was going to the logistics bay. They were at the junction simultaneously. He said, "You move like the outpost was built around you." He said it before the editing arrived. The 4 days of thinking had produced the editing that prevented the saying. The junction had produced the moment without the 4 days editing's presence. The saying had set itself in the gap between the thinking and the editing. She stopped. She turned. He was in the specific quality of someone who had said the thing and who was now in the things having been said, and who was finding the things having been said to be the most significant logistical miscalculation of the current posting. She looked at him. The look had the quality of the full assessment, not the social assessment, the tactical assessment, the specific quality of the look that the documentation had been trying to describe when the documentation said unmatched. The look lasted what the look required. She said, "You are now my prisoner." He said, "I'm sorry." She said, "The Keth tradition's prisoner declaration. You have made the statement that the tradition designates as the declaration's trigger. I have exercised the tradition's option. You are my prisoner," he said. The compliment about moving through the outpost triggered. She said, "The statement of the specific observation of the specific quality." "Yes. The tradition designates that as the trigger." He said, "I didn't know that." She said, "No, I could see that." He said, "Is this?" She said, "Yes. The declaration is binding under the Keth tradition's customs. The bilateral relationships cultural protocol recognizes the Keth tradition's social customs in the frontier zone's operational context." He said, "Yes." He said it with the quality of someone who was processing the significant information and who was finding the processing's result to be the situation he was currently in. He said, "The prisoner status." She said, "Yes." He said, "What does the prisoner status?" She said, "You'll receive the full account from the cultural liaison officer. Report to my briefing at the 6th hour." She moved past the junction with the quality of someone who had completed the function's current phase. He was at the junction with the quality of someone who was in the significant unexpected, and who was finding the significant unexpected to be the most interesting logistical situation the 3-month posting had produced. He thought, "You move like the outpost was built around you." He thought, "Yes, that was accurate." He thought, "Yes." Vel Soreth was the outpost's Keth cultural liaison officer. He was 41 years old and had been in the bilateral relationships cultural liaison function for 9 years, and he received the logistics specialist's request for the prisoner declaration's full account with the quality of someone who was in the presence of the unprecedented. and who was managing the unprecedented with the professionalism the unprecedented required. He said the Keth tradition's prisoner declaration. Cael said, yes, he said, Senior Warrior Commander Thael made the declaration. Cael said, yes, he said, based on a compliment. Cael said, yes, he said. You told her she moved like the outpost was built around her. Cael said, yes. He was quiet for the duration of someone who was in the significant thing and who was in it with the full quality of the significant thing's presence. He said, in 9 years of the cultural liaison function, I have not previously encountered the prisoner declaration triggered by a compliment from a joint authority logistics specialist. Cael said, yes. I gathered it was unusual, he said. The tradition's prisoner declaration has several triggers. The combat trigger, the defeated opponent who demonstrates the specific quality that warrants the evaluation rather than the standard outcome. The assessment trigger, the person who demonstrates the observable quality that the declaring warrior identifies as warranting the sustained evaluation. Cael said, the assessment trigger. He said, yes. The statement of the specific observation of the specific quality. The tradition designates that form as the assessment trigger. Cael said, I told her she moved like the outpost was built around her. He said, yes. The specific observation of the specific quality of her movement through the outpost's operational environment. The tradition designates that as the assessment trigger. Cael said, and the prisoner status. He said, the prisoner status is the tradition's form for the sustained evaluation's conduct. The declaring warrior has identified a person of sufficient interest to warrant the sustained evaluation. The prisoner status provides the structure. Cael said, what structure? He said, 4 rules. The prisoner accompanies the declaring warrior to the declaring warrior's daily function. The prisoner gives the honest answer to any direct question. The prisoner cannot refuse a reasonable challenge. The prisoner's status concludes when the declaring warrior determines the evaluation is complete. Cael said, what counts as a reasonable challenge? He said, the declaring warrior determines reasonableness. Cael said, yes. He said it with the quality of someone who was in the situation, and who was finding the situation to be the situation he was in. He said, yes. He said, the tradition's prisoner declaration in the assessment triggers form is the tradition's instrument for the evaluation of a person the declaring warrior finds genuinely interesting. The combat record and the tactical function are the declaring warrior's primary context. A person who produces the specific quality that the assessment trigger designates is a person whose quality the declaring warrior wants to understand. Cael said she wants to understand me. He said yes, in the tradition's specific form. Cael said through the prisoner status. He said yes. Cael said, because I told her she moved like the outpost was built around her. He said yes, he said. The statement was accurate. She does move like the outpost was built around her. The perceptual quality of the statement, the specific observation of the specific quality rather than the generic complement, is what the tradition designates as the trigger. Cael said the generic complement doesn't trigger it. He said no. The generic complement is the social form. The specific observation of the specific quality is the assessment trigger. You observed specifically. Cael said, I was trying to say something that wouldn't be the generic complement. He said, yes. You succeeded. The 6th hour arrived, and he reported to her briefing with the quality of someone who had the full account and who was in the full account situation. She was at the briefing room's operational display. She said, the cultural liaison officer gave you the full account. He said, yes. She said, the 4 rules. He said, yes. She said, questions. He said, 1 question. She said, yes. He said, the declaration's duration. The prisoner's status concludes when you determine the evaluation is complete. What are the evaluation's criteria? She said, the evaluation's criteria are mine. He said, yes. What are they? She said, I'll know when the evaluation is complete. He said, yes. He said it with the quality of someone who was in the situation's specific ambiguity and who was managing the ambiguity with the quality it deserved. She said, the first challenge. Tomorrow at the 3rd hour. The tactical assessment exercise. He said, I'm a logistics specialist. She said, yes, I know. He said, yes. The first challenge was the tactical assessment exercise, the specific exercise that she used for the evaluation of spatial reasoning, the exercise that placed the assessed person in the simulated operational environment and observed the decisions the person made in the environment's navigation. He was in the simulated environment with the quality of the logistics specialist. The person whose spatial reasoning was the spatial reasoning of the supply chain's organization rather than the tactical movements optimization. He made the logistics specialist's decisions. The supply route logic, the resource allocation priority, the movement pattern of someone who was organizing the environment's elements rather than navigating the tactical problem. She observed. After the exercise, she said, "The spatial reasoning is not the tactical specialist's spatial reasoning." He said, "No, I'm a logistics specialist." She said, "Yes. You organize the environment's resources before you assess the tactical problem." He said, "Yes, that's the functions approach." She said, "The tactical assessment standard outcome for the logistics specialist is the tactical failure." He said, "Yes. I expected that." She said, "The resource organization produced the specific configuration that the tactical failure's moment required for the recovery." He said, "Yes. The recovery route used the organized resources." She said, "The recovery was not optimal." He said, "No." She said, "It was sufficient." He said, "Yes. Sufficient was what was available." She said, "Yes." She said it with the quality of the assessment's data received. The second challenge was the direct question session, 17 questions in 40 minutes at the briefing room's table. The questions had the quality of the assessment's instrument. The specific questions designed to produce the honest answer that the prisoner's status required. The questions that would reveal the specific qualities the evaluation was designed to evaluate. She asked, "What do you find genuinely difficult?" He said, "The cross-species supply chain's cultural assumptions, the different traditions' different relationships with the supply function. I find the navigation of the different assumptions genuinely difficult and genuinely interesting simultaneously." She asked, "What do you find genuinely easy?" He said, "The arrangement. Seeing the elements and finding the configuration that puts them in the correct relationship. The arrangement comes easily." She asked, "What did you intend by the compliment?" He said, "I wanted to say something that wasn't the generic form. I've been thinking about it for 4 days." She said, "4 days?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The specific observation took 4 days." He said, "The observation was present earlier. The saying took 4 days." She was quiet for the specific duration of the assessment data received. She asked 15 more questions. He answered them with the quality of someone who was in the honest answers requirement and who was in the requirement in the genuine answers, not the performed honesty, the actual answers to the actual questions. The third challenge was the supply route problem. The specific logistical problem she presented as a wit test, the problem that she framed as the tactical supply problem, but which was, in its actual structure, the lateral thinking problem disguised as the standard logistics assessment. He recognized the disguise. He addressed the actual structure. She said, "You identified the lateral structure." He said, "Yes." The standard logistics assessment wouldn't have worked on the actual problem, she said. Most assessments don't identify the lateral structure. He said, "The arrangement function. I look for the configuration before I apply the standard approach." She said, "Yes." She said, "The solution is creative rather than optimal." He said, "Yes." The optimal solution requires the elements the problem didn't include. The creative solution works with the actual elements. She said, "Yes." The fourth challenge was the corridor navigation in the outpost's unpowered section during the maintenance cycle, the practical navigation problem in the actual outpost environment during the specific operational period when the standard systems were offline. He navigated with the logistics specialist's knowledge of the outpost's infrastructure, the supply route knowledge, the specific familiarity with the outpost's physical organization that the 3 months of the logistics function had produced. She observed, after the navigation, she said, "You know the outpost's physical organization thoroughly." He said, "The supply chain requires the physical organization's knowledge. The logistics function mapped the outpost in the first month." She said, "The tactical functions mapping and the logistics functions mapping are different." He said, "Yes. The tactical mapping addresses the operational positions. The logistics mapping addresses the resource distribution. The physical organization is the same organization, and the two mappings are the two accounts of the same organization." She said, "Yes." He said, "Yes." He said it with the quality of someone who was finding the week's challenges to be the most interesting operational experience the 3-month posting had produced. The quality of someone who was in the evaluation structure, and who was finding the evaluation structure to be the genuinely interesting problem. The second week had a different quality. He noted this with the attention of someone who had been in the first week's evaluation and who had the first week's data for the second week's reading. The first week's quality was the assessment's quality. The full attention of someone conducting the evaluation. The specific quality of the person who is in the evaluation function with the full expression of the function's capacity. He had been the subject of that quality for the first week, and he had found the first week's quality to be the most sustained and thorough evaluation he had experienced in 4 years of the logistics function's postings and assessments. The second week's quality had the additional layer. The additional layer was the layer that arrived after the evaluation's active phase, the layer that the assessment's completion produced in the assessor, the quality of someone who had the evaluation's data and who was in the data's presence rather than in the data's collection. The data's presence produced a different relationship with the evaluated person. He was noting this with the attention of the arrangement function, the specific attention to the element's configuration, the reading of how the elements were arranged rather than what the individual elements were. The arrangement was different in the second week. She was in the daily function's accompaniment, the prisoner status's first rule, the prisoner accompanying the declaring warrior to the declaring warrior's daily function, with the quality that the second week's different arrangement produced. The tactical assessments and the operational briefings and the outpost security evaluation work. She did these with him present, and she did them with the quality of the second week. He was present. He was present with the quality of the logistics specialist in the tactical context, the person whose function was adjacent to the tactical function, and who was, in the adjacency, in the tactical function's work without the tactical function's training. He was useful in specific ways. The supply chain knowledge applied to the tactical assessment's logistics dimensions. The arrangement function applied to the operational briefing's resource allocation questions. She used the specific ways. Not because the prisoner status required it, the prisoner status required the accompaniment. She used the specific ways because the specific ways were useful. He noted this. On the second week's second day, she said, at the operational briefing's end, the eastern perimeter's supply route. He said, yes, the third route alternative. The second route has the terrain issue that the seasonal change produces, she said. I know the terrain issue. The second route's tactical advantage is the cover the terrain provides. He said, the cover's value against the supply delay's cost. She said, yes, he said. The third route's supply timing allows the eastern perimeter's operational window before the terrain issue affects the second route. The cover's value is the defensive advantage at the perimeter. If the timing is the priority, the third route's supply timing is the instrument, she said, and if the defensive advantage is the priority, he said, the second route's cover. But the supply timing's window closes, she said, yes. She said it with the quality of the useful data received and with the quality of the second week's additional layer simultaneously. He noted both. On the second week's third day, she said, the direct question. He said, yes. She said, the 4 days. Before the compliment, what were you trying to say? He said, I was trying to say the specific thing rather than the generic thing. The generic complement was the available form. The generic form wasn't the accurate form. I was looking for the accurate form, she said, and the accurate form took 4 days. He said, the accurate form was the observation. The observation was present earlier. The saying required, he found the word, the moment without the editing. She said, the moment without the editing produced the accurate form. He said, yes. The junction, the moment without the 4 days editing. She said, the unedited accurate form is the assessment trigger. He said, yes, I know that now, she said. You knew it wasn't the generic complement when you said it. He said, yes. I knew it was the accurate thing. I didn't know it was the trigger. She said, yes. She said it with the quality of the second week's additional layer, the quality of someone who was in the assessment's data and who was finding the data interesting in the specific way of the person rather than the assessor. He noted this. He noted it with the quality of the arrangement function, the reading of the configuration, the specific thing that the arrangement produced when he looked at it. He thought. The second week's quality is different from the first week's quality. He thought, yes, he thought, I'm finding the second week's quality more interesting than the first week's quality. He thought, yes. On the second week's 4th day, the security incident arrived at the eastern perimeter. The alert was the alert of the specific incident that the security assessment had been evaluating the outpost's capacity for the frontier zone's operational hazard in the actual form rather than the simulation's form. He was in the logistics bay. The alert produced the logistics function's response, the supply chain's immediate management, the specific reallocation of the outpost's resources that the incident required, The logistics specialists function in the security incident's operational context. She was in the operational briefing center. The incident's response required the immediate coordinated deployment, the tactical assessment's guidance, and the logistics function's support, the specific combination that the incident's requirements produced. They were in the outpost's main corridor simultaneously. She said, the eastern perimeter, the supply cache at the third route's junction. He said, the cache has the specific inventory, the defensive barrier components and the communication relay equipment. She said, yes. The third route's timing, he said, 17 minutes to the cache from the current position. The second route's cover is available from the cache's position, she said. Yes, he said, the third route to the cache, the second route's cover from the cache. She said, yes. He said, yes. They moved. The incident's resolution was the resolution of the coordinated response. The tactical assessment's deployment guidance and the logistics functions supply chain knowledge producing the combination that the incident required. The incident was resolved. The post-incident assessment had the quality of the shared significant effort's completion. He had been in the shared significant effort before the previous postings, the previous operational contexts, the specific quality that the shared effort produced in the people who had been in the effort together and who were in the effort's aftermath. The post-incident quality was the quality of the aftermath, the effort's completion present, the working together's evidence in the resolution's form. She was in the post-incident assessment with the quality of the second week's additional layer and the shared effort's aftermath simultaneously. He was in the assessment with the quality of the arrangement function reading the configuration. The configuration was 2 people in the post-incident quality who had been in the prisoner statuses 2 weeks and the evaluation's challenges, and the second week's daily accompaniment and the eastern perimeter's coordination, and who were, in the post-incident quality, in the combination of all of it. She said the prisoner status. He said, yes. She said, the evaluation is complete. He said, yes. He said it with the quality of someone who was in the conclusion's presence and who was in the conclusion's presence in the specific ambiguity of the conclusion, the ambiguity of the thing that had been the 2 weeks' most significant experience and which was now at the declared conclusion. She said, the prisoner status concludes when I determine the evaluation is complete. He said, yes. She said, I'm not determining that yet. He said, yes. He said it with the quality of the significant unexpected's arrival and the quality of the arrangement function simultaneously, the reading of the configuration that the unexpected's arrival had produced. He said, the evaluation is complete, but you're not concluding the prisoner status. She said, yes. He said, yes. He said it with the quality of someone who was in the ambiguity's positive form. She said, the evaluation produced the assessment data. The assessment data produced the additional question. He said, what question? She said, the alliance question. He said, yes. He said, tell me the alliance question. She said, the Keth tradition has the prisoner declaration and the alliance declaration. The prisoner declaration is the instrument of the sustained evaluation. The alliance declaration is the instrument of the sustained partnership. He said, yes. She said, the prisoner declaration's evaluation produces the alliance declaration's basis. The assessment data is the alliance declaration's foundation. He said, yes. She said, the evaluation produced the assessment data that the alliance declaration requires. He said, yes. She said, the alliance declaration requires the evaluated person's consent. He said, yes. She said, the prisoner status concludes when the alliance declaration is made or when the alliance declaration is declined. He said, and if it's declined, she said, the prisoner status concludes and the evaluation's data is the evaluation's data. He said, yes. He was quiet for the duration of the significant thing present. She said, I want to explain the alliance declaration's content before you respond. He said, yes. She said, the Keth tradition's alliance is the mutual commitment to the shared function. The alliance partners maintain the shared function across the operational contexts, the tactical and the logistical, the Keth tradition and the joint authority function. The alliance is the recognition of the complementary qualities. He said, the tactical and the logistical. She said, yes. The assessment's data, the spatial reasoning that organizes before it navigates, the arrangement function that finds the configuration rather than the standard approach, the supply route knowledge that produced the eastern perimeter's resolution. He said, yes. She said, the complementary qualities. He said, yes. He said, the generic complement wouldn't have triggered the prisoner declaration. She said, no. He said, The specific observation triggered the prisoner declaration. She said, yes. He said, the specific observation is the Alliance Declaration's basis. She said, yes. The assessment evaluated what the specific observation identified. He said, yes. He said, and the Alliance Declaration. She said, yes. He said, I want to ask you one question before I respond. She said, yes. He said, the 4 days. I was in your proximity for 4 days before the junction. You were in mine. What did you observe in the 4 days? She said, I observed the logistics specialist in the Frontier Outpost's operational context. The function executed with the specific quality of the genuine engagement. The arrangement function applied to the cross-species supply chain's cultural assumptions. He said, yes. She said, and I observed the 4 days of the not saying. He said, yes. She said, the 4 days of the not saying had the specific quality of someone who was looking for the accurate form rather than settling for the available form. He said, yes. She said, the 4 days produced the specific observation at the junction. He said, yes. She said, the specific observation was the accurate form. He said, yes. He said, and the prisoner declaration. She said, yes. The prisoner declaration was the recognition of the specific observation's quality. The quality that took 4 days and arrived at the junction without the editing. He said, yes. He said, the unedited accurate form. She said, yes. He said, you declared me your prisoner because I said the accurate thing without the editing. She said, yes. He said, yes. He said it with the quality of the significant thing in the simple form that was the most accurate expression of the thing it described. He said the Alliance Declaration. She said, yes. He said, yes. He said it in the register of the direct acceptance. She said, yes. She said it with the quality of the declaration's receipt. The quality of the person who had conducted the evaluation and who had made the Alliance Declaration's offer and who was, in the direct acceptance's arrival, in the Alliance Declaration's completion. He said the prisoner status concludes. She said yes. He said, and the Alliance begins. She said yes. He said yes. He said, I have a question about the Alliance. She said yes. He said, the Alliance partners maintain the shared function across the operational contexts. She said yes. He said the tactical and the logistical. She said yes. He said, the Eastern Perimeter's resolution produced the combination's evidence. She said, yes. He said, the Alliance will produce more of the combination. She said, yes. He said, yes. He said, and the Keth tradition's Alliance Declaration, is there a specific form? She said, yes. He said, what is it? She said, I make the declaration. You receive it. The receipt is the consent. He said, yes. She said, the declaration. She said it in the Keth language, the formal register of the tradition's significant moments, the specific language of the declaration's form. She said it with the quality of someone who was in the tradition's full form and who was giving the full form to the moment that required it. Then she said it in the common language. She said, the evaluation identified the complementary quality. The complementary quality is the foundation of the shared function. The Keth tradition's Alliance Declaration commits the declaring warrior to the shared function's maintenance across the operational contexts. The Alliance is the recognition and the commitment simultaneously. He said, I received the declaration and the Alliance. He said it in the register the tradition required. She said, yes.